Darren Mougey and Aaron Glenn speak to the media at the NFL Scouting Combine, and we learn about how the Jets are going to build their team in 2025 and beyond. Let's break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, February 26th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Well, Darren Mougey and Aaron Glenn spoke to the media yesterday at the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis, and today we're going to break down what we said. Now, we kind of previewed this on yesterday's show. If you're an everydayer, you probably heard what I had to say. No general manager or head coach is going to give away their entire offseason plan at one of these press conferences. But sometimes they offer you some insight into the way the team is thinking or little nuggets of information about the team strategy. And I think we got some interesting stuff from both Muji and Glenn. So let's begin by talking about what the new Jets general manager, Darren Mougey, had to say during his brief press conference yesterday. Now, he made one comment which drew a lot of media attention. And I think everybody's taking the wrong lesson from this. And on yesterday's show, again, if you're an everyday, you probably heard what I had to say. I mentioned that sometimes you have to read between the lines, and you have to figure out if the team is trying to put a message out there for the rest of the league. And Darren Mougey was asked whether the Jets are going to look to potentially trade up, and he gave an answer that people are just running with. Muji said that it was possible the Jets would look to trade up. Now, the quote was, "I think at pick 7 right now, we're going to be open to potentially moving up for a player or moving back. All of those options are on the table right now." And the reaction to that in the New York media has been, well, the Jets are looking to trade up. And I think part of this has to do with some of the rumors from last week about the Jets potentially looking to trade up for a quarterback, stuff that, is great for content creators. It generates a lot of discussion. But let's look at what Muji actually said. He said, again, at pick 7 right now, we're going to be open to potentially moving up for a player or moving back. All of those options are on the table right now. So he did not commit to moving up. He didn't say the Jets are going to move up. In fact, if the Jets were not interested in moving up, you'd expect him to say if the Jets were interested in moving up, you'd expect him to say the opposite. You'd expect him to say anything else. What he says, well, maybe we'll move up, maybe we'll move back. That is the most generic GM speak you could possibly have. And yet people are now insisting that the Jets are going to move up. Now, look, it's always possible the Jets are looking to move up. Jets obviously need a quarterback. They may have fallen in love with Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward. So I'm not ruling anything out, but it feels like in some ways the New York media is trying to will a trade up into existence with the New York Jets, because I think really the only thing Darren Mougey has ruled out with that statement is the idea the Jets are just going to let the time run out and pass on their pick. Yeah, of course, they might trade up. They may trade back. They may stay put. All of those options are on the table. But we've taken that generic comment, which is the ultimate in GM speak, and tried to turn it into proof that the Jets are going to make a big move. Now, in fairness, Muji was responding to a question that was asked by Connor Hughes of SNY about whether the Jets have enough talent to potentially give up a big package to move up. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I do," but they were followed by everything about maybe potentially we could trade up, potentially we could trade down. Total GM speak. Sometimes teams put out signals to the rest of the league. I don't think this was one of those times. I think Muji pretty much said every option's on the table except us passing on the pick. So a little bit of silly NFL offseason, silly season there, in my opinion. But Muji did make a couple of comments about Aaron Rodgers that I thought were worthwhile. Now, one of the things doesn't really impact the Jets. Muji responded to the reports that the Jets made some sort of ultimatum that Rodgers had to cancel his Pat McAfee show appearances, and Rodgers had to go to all the mandatory offseason programs, events this year if he wanted to come back. Muji denied that there was an ultimatum. I don't think that's necessarily mutually exclusive, though, with the idea that the report was accurate, because the more that comes out, the more it feels like the Jets had kind of decided to move on from Aaron Rodgers. it kind of feels like they were ready to make a move. But out of respect to Rodgers, they decided to have a meeting with him. And maybe if Rodgers really surprised them, and maybe if Rodgers just blew them away and said, like, these are the things I'm willing to commit to, they were open to having their mind changed. But the more that comes out, the more it sounds like the Jets had kind of made up their mind. And beyond that, the more that comes out, the more it seems like almost all the candidates the Jets interviewed just kind of had the feeling that the team should move on from Rodgers, which I think is very logical. I think that it meant for many reasons, which we've discussed and we will continue to discuss on this show, the Jets decided it was time to turn the page. But Muji did offer one actual piece of hard news, and he said that the Jets are leaning towards making Rodgers a post-June 1st cut. And the Jets essentially have a decision to make with Rodgers. Do they make, when they cut him, do they make him a regular cut, or do they make him a post-June 1st cut? And that will have salary cap implications for the 2025 Jets, depending on what the team decides to do. Now, if the Jets cut Rodgers before June 1st, or the Jets deem him a regular cut, they have $49 million in dead money. If they deem him a post-June 1st cut, essentially Rodgers can be cut, so he won't take up a roster spot. But if they deem him a post-June 1st cut, essentially for cap purposes, until June 1st, it'll be like he's on the team. So Rodgers' cap hit for the 2025 season is scheduled to be $23.5 million. So if the Jets deem Rodgers a post-June 1st cut, his cap number remains $23.5 million through June 1st, which gives the Jets a benefit this offseason, because if they make him a regular cut, it's $49 million. So you go from a $49 million cut if it's pre-June 1st to $23.5 through the offseason. And then once June 1st hits, Rodgers' cap number drops to $14 million. So we dropped from 23.5 to 14. So after June 1st, that clears up that opens up an extra $9.5 million of cap space for the Jets. The catch is that Rodgers then counts for $35 million against the 2026 cap. So essentially, over the next 2 years, Rodgers is going to count for $49 million. The question is whether we do the full 49 this year, or whether we split it 14 this year and 35 next year. And until June 1st, Rodgers counts for $23.5 million. So a little complex, but hopefully you understand that. Essentially what it comes down to is, do the Jets want to split it over 2 years and have the hit lower this year so they have a little more cap space to work with in 2025 in exchange for losing cap space in 2026? I've been of the mindset that, for the Jets, in a year where you have a first-year head coach and a first-year GM, and it's setting up to be kind of a reset year, I would personally feel like maybe the move is to take the entire hit up front. But in some ways, it doesn't matter that much, because at the end of the day, you're able to carry over unused cap space. So that makes like the long-term implications less significant, because at the end of the day, it's going to be $49 million, and any dollar you save this year can be carried over to next year. So ultimately, it doesn't make that big of a deal. Muji said that there's no final decision that's been made, but it will open up more cap space for the Jets to work with this year, and next year, maybe they'll have a little bit more flexibility, and maybe the Jets have just decided it's easier to carry $35 million next year than the full 49 this year. So something worth watching. Muji's, again, he left himself some flexibility. He left himself some wiggle room so that the Jets won't necessarily need to commit to making Rodgers a post-June 1st cut. But at this point, Darren Mougey, the Jets GM, says the Jets are leaning towards making Rodgers a post-June 1st cut. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to what the head coach had to say, Aaron Glenn. And even though Aaron Glenn's the head coach and Darren Mougey's the GM, Glenn's a guy with a personnel background. He may have a say in some of the players the Jets acquire. And he offered some insight that there could be a big philosophical change from the Joe Douglas, Robert Saleh era and the types of players the Jets look for. And we'll talk about what that change is and why it's important as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Jets head coach Aaron Glenn addressed the media after Darren Mougey spoke yesterday at the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis. And I think that these GM head coach press conferences, especially before the start of the offseason, tend to get overhyped. And I think many times people read too much into their words. A good example of that was something I discussed in the first segment, where Darren Mougey threw out a very generic statement about how the Jets may trade up or trade back, and it's being run with by the New York media. But I do think there are moments where you get candor from a coach or a GM. And it typically happens when they're speaking in general terms of the way they're trying to build the team, because nobody's going to give away their strategy for the offseason right before the offseason begins. You're not going to hear about what players they want to target, in the draft or free agency, but they sometimes give you general insights about what they're looking for. And I think it's especially interesting when you have a new head coach and a new general manager combo, as the New York Jets have right now. And Aaron Glenn said something, and this was something I was looking for. I mentioned this yesterday about what I was looking for. Glenn was asked in general terms what sort of players he wants. And he said, we're looking for smart, tough, aggressive, and resilient players. Now, Glenn also, talked about speed being important. He talked about length being important. But Glenn's first comments about this were, we're looking for smart, tough, aggressive, and resilient players. And that, to me, speaks to maybe a broader term. The term I would use is football character. And I think if you looked at the Jets in 2024, there was talent there, but there were also got a lot of guys who lacked what I would call football character. And that's guys who, really care about the game, guys who are focused on the team, guys who are about winning. I think the Jets really lacked that. And I think what Glenn said shows that this is going to be a different type of organization from the one we saw under Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. Now, I want to make it clear that, the easiest thing to do in the world is to come away looking good at one of these press conferences when you never coached a game yet. And what I'm about to say does not mean necessarily that Aaron Glenn is better than Robert Saleh or Joe Douglas. It doesn't mean that Darren Mougey is better than Joe Douglas. It doesn't mean that Aaron Glenn's better than Robert Saleh. But I do think what Aaron Glenn said shows that the Jets are turning the page in a rather profound way from what they had last year with Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. Because I think what was clear to anybody who followed this team in Joe Douglas's 5 seasons is he valued physical traits above all else. And that's a philosophical thing. And that's not a negative statement on Joe Douglas, because there are a lot of great GMs who put an absolute premium on guys who had great physical traits. Joe Douglas's mentor, Ozzie Newsome, who was one of the great GMs of his era, the guy who taught Joe Douglas everything he knows, and the Baltimore Ravens. That's the team that prioritizes physical traits above all else. They may not admit it, but they do if you look at the way they draft and if you read about their philosophies and some of the influences Ozzie Newsome had, where they want guys who have a certain size, certain level of strength, speed. They value those traits, and their general view, and you can see it through their drafting. They believe in their coaching staff's ability to get guys who have those physical traits to perform at a really high level. And even if those guys are not technically sound, they think that they'll eventually get it out of them. And it's worked very well for the Baltimore Ravens through the years. So when I say that, I'm not offering a value judgment on Joe Douglas's philosophy. Now, I think that there were a lot of areas where Joe Douglas failed in his execution. I don't think his philosophy was necessarily unsound, though. On the same note, Aaron Glenn saying these things, I don't think it's necessarily true that Aaron Glenn's philosophy is superior to that of Joe Douglas's or Robert Saleh. I just think it's different. And Glenn has shown that he's focused on, again, football character, guys who are going to work hard, guys who are going to commit to the team, guys who are focused on winning. And that doesn't mean that Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh were not looking for those things. But I think it's clear that they valued physical traits above all else. When Glenn says, I want guys who are smart, tough, aggressive, and resilient players, that doesn't mean he's going to disregard the physical traits, because he even mentioned the physical traits. He mentioned length being important. He mentioned speed being important. That doesn't mean that, he's going to look away from these things. But I think the first thing you're looking for in a player speaks a lot about the type of team you're trying to build. Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh tried to build a team that could just physically outmatch everybody. I think Glenn's trying to build a team, and along with Muji, that is going to be tenacious. It's going to get after the opponent. And, when you look at that 2024 Jets team, and even you can even go back before 2024 in previous seasons under Douglas and Saleh, there were a lot of guys who were not with this team for the right reasons, I'd say. And, the most glaring example, the easiest one, and, I shouldn't say I'm lucky as a podcaster for having this guy because he's such an obvious case, because I wish the guy wasn't on the team. But Hassan Reddick's a perfect example. A guy with all the talent in the world. A guy who, if he had shown up and worked hard and focused on the team, he probably would have had a 10-sack season. But instead, Hassan Reddick was focused on a new contract. He didn't care. He just wanted to get paid. And when he didn't get paid, what happened? He pouted, he held out, and when he got back, he did nothing. I mean, the guy. I mean, he was an awful player for the Jets in 2024. It's maybe a harsh criticism, but that guy did nothing after he came back and collected paychecks. Like, I don't know what he was like in practice, but I saw him on the field in games. I saw the film after the games. That guy showed up and collected paychecks. He was a guy that did not have great football character. And you can go down the line. One of the guys I've talked about on the show in the past, a guy who's come up quite a bit because he's gone to Philadelphia and had success, is Mekhi Becton. Well, Mekhi Becton played guard with the Philadelphia Eagles. With the Jets, he said he only wanted to play left tackle. In fact, not only would it wasn't so much, he wasn't upset with the Jets because they played him at guard. He was upset with the Jets because they played him at right tackle. And maybe Mekhi Becton was a guy who needed to get knocked down to have the motivation to come back and succeed. Mekhi Becton was a guy with all the physical tools in the world. When the Jets drafted him, I and everybody else, when they passed on Tristan Wirfs, said, it was the high upside play because Becton clearly had more physical ability than Tristan Wirfs. The question is, would he reach it? And he wasn't able to reach it with New York. Now with Philadelphia, a different position, a different mindset. Things have changed a little bit. Again, like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Glenn's definitively better than Saleh, that Muji's definitively better than Douglas, that Muji Glenn's definitively better than Douglas Saleh. It's certainly not based on this because at the end of the day, both the physical attributes and your football character are very important. It's tough to build a winning team when you don't have both. But you certainly, as a team, prioritize certain attributes over others. And I think that the Jets have gone from a team over the last 4 or 5 years that prioritized speed, the physical stuff, the size, the speed, the strength, and are now going to focus more on effort, on the things Aaron Glenn mentioned: smartness, toughness, aggressiveness, resiliency. Another thing Glenn said that what I thought was interesting was he specifically talked about the wide receiver position. He said, if you're a good player, we're going to do everything we can to get you on this team. And that's one last note I wanted to throw in there. And the reason I throw that in there is that there's a perception that I think is unfair that because Glenn comes from a defensive background, that he's not going to care about offense. Well, you know what? Aaron Glenn coached with Detroit. He saw what a good offense could do. Before Glenn was with Detroit, he was a position coach with the New Orleans Saints. Worked under Sean Payton, one of the great offensive minds of his generation. He was there when Drew Brees was there. He saw what great quarterback play. He saw what great players can bring to you. So that's just like another sign. Glenn talked about the receiver position being important. I understand why people are skeptical because we've been through a lot of defensive coaches here who have not worked out, a lot of defensive coaches who maybe didn't value offense enough. But just because Glenn's a defensive coach, that doesn't mean he'll fail. It doesn't automatically mean he'll fail to value the offensive side of the ball, because any good head coach from the defensive side of the ball has seen how difficult it is to play against great offenses and wants to build a great offense for his team. So again, these are just broader thoughts. I don't want to overstate this stuff, but I think this stuff is important. And I think it's worth listening to. I think there's one other thing Aaron Glenn said about the team that is worth listening to. As we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets, we'll get to that. It has to do with excuses. And Glenn made it clear that there will not be any excuses for this team in 2025, no matter what people think. We'll go into that in more detail as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your bets into a same-game parlay. You'll love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your favorite team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you'll never feel like you've missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're breaking down what Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey had to say at their press conference at the NFL Scouting Combine yesterday in Indianapolis. I'm going to close out by talking about something Glenn said that really drew my attention. And look, we'll see how Aaron Glenn does as Jets head coach, and he will ultimately be judged by his wins and losses. But one thing I would say is that having watched his introductory press conference a few weeks ago, and now having watched his press conference at the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis, I will say that man can command a room. Look, we know that Robert Saleh ultimately was done in by his lack of wins and by losing too many games. And it wasn't because Saleh was bad in press conferences, although he certainly was. And we know that media relations do matter in New York, in this market, with this fan base, with this media, with this group of media. But ultimately, it comes down to wins and losses. So, look, Aaron Glenn commanding a room in press conferences before he's coached a game, it's not going to result in wins and losses. But it's clear, he's a guy, he's a leader. He's a guy who can lead a team. And he said something that really drew my attention. He essentially said that, well, I got to tell you the quote, "We're here to win now." And then he went on. He clearly got frustrated when he kept getting asked questions about Aaron Rodgers. And he said, "It really," and I'll edit this because, we're a family show here. He said, "It really gets me angry when we just keep talking about one player. We have good players. We have Quincy Williams. We have Quinnen Williams. We have AVT. We have Joe Tippmann, and other quality players on this team." He said, "Our goal is to win games." And that to me stuck out because one of my biggest criticisms with Robert Saleh is that I felt like he was too quick to make excuses. And I could say the same thing about, we could go back before Robert Saleh. I think this was true of Adam Gase. I think in many ways it was true of the Jets under Rex Ryan near the end, where the Jets are just like, I feel like this organization, it became okay to lose games. Robert Saleh had his excuses when Zach Wilson was injured. When Aaron Rodgers got injured. He had Zach Wilson at quarterback. I mean, there is a report that came out last year that Robert Saleh was doing research on head coaches' records with backup quarterbacks, how no head coach won with their backup quarterback. And you certainly got the feeling in 2023 that you had a Jets team that in many ways felt bad for itself when Aaron Rodgers got injured. And excuses, you just can't make excuses in the NFL. At the end of the day, look, if things go wrong, and it's a fair thing to say, we can make excuses for you. But as an NFL coach, you have to demand the best in your team. And you have to expect to win. You have to plan to try and win. And I don't feel like Robert Saleh did that enough. I think the same was true of Adam Gase. Adam Gase almost viewed winning as secondary to running the team the way he wanted to. Aaron Glenn said, "We're here to win games." And look, that alone is not going to win games. We know that. If the Jets go out there and don't have a good season next year, it's not going to make Aaron Glenn immune from criticism. Neither are the early returns where he's handling these press conferences very well. He's coming off as a very forceful, very inspiring type of leader. And I'll be honest with you, at this early stage, I've been impressed by what I've seen from Aaron Glenn. Now, it's a very early stage. Again, we have to see how the team performs on the field because ultimately that's what Glenn will be judged on. And if 2-3 years down the line, the Jets haven't won enough games, I'm not going to care that I was impressed by the way he handled the first couple of weeks on the job before he really had to do anything. But everything I've seen from Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey so far has been what I've wanted to see. If you'd asked me when the Jets hired Glenn and Muji, what would you want to see up until February 26th? I'd say I'd want these guys to come off as professional. I wouldn't want these guys to look ridiculous when they're presenting themselves in front of the team. I'd want them to come to a quick resolution on the Aaron Rodgers situation. I want them to handle it professionally. I'd want them to show respect to Rodgers, but I want them to make a definitive decision based on the information in front of them. And I think it's fair to say they've done all of these things. And the other thing I would have told you is I want there to be expectations for 2025. And that doesn't mean you go out and do something crazy. That doesn't mean, you continue to torture cap trying to chase a 7 seed in the AFC playoffs. You balance it with the future because we know that for Glenn and Muji, 2025 is actually going to be the least important season record-wise. It's really about, can they build a consistent winner? And this year's team obviously has obstacles in front of it. The salary cap situation is not great. And you can maneuver the numbers anyway to try and claim the Jets salary cap situation isn't that bad. It's not a good cap situation. When you look at the amount of money they're going to have to spend versus the holes they have to fill, it's not. And that's the thing is, like, sometimes people sometimes people frame it as though it's just about how much money you have to spend, but it's also about what you need. Jets need a lot. Now, the good news is that it'll take a year to unclog the cap. We're not talking about a 5-year rebuild. We're talking about 1 year to unclog the cap. But during that year, that doesn't mean that it's okay. That doesn't mean it's acceptable for the coach or GM to say, well, we're rebuilding. I want my coach to have the attitude Glenn has, that we're not going to make excuses. And one of the things you have to admire about Aaron Glenn is the way he handled the Detroit Lions this past year on the defensive side of the ball, because that was a team that was decimated by injury. And it got to a point where, it was ridiculous to expect them to do anything effectively. I mean, they were playing practice squad level players. They were signing guys off the street who were thrust into starting roles, who didn't even really know the system. And then points late in the season, the Lions defense got torched because they're essentially playing like a second half of a preseason type personnel on defense. But Glenn didn't make excuses. And until it got to a point where it was ridiculous, with backups in there, he got results. And I think part of that goes to the mindset of not making excuses, because the second you make an excuse in the NFL, it's easy to just kind of tune out. And I'm encouraged to see that Glenn won't do that. And, maybe it's a small thing. Of course it's a small thing, but these are small things that I think have been lacking from the Jets organization that I'm hopeful that the new coach will instill. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. We're going to be a little late this week. We'll have our weekly mailbag show tomorrow. Can't wait to answer your questions then.